to this webinar on the finances as part of our major assessment of assets and of the skills that we bring as faiths to creating faith long-term plans. My name is Martin Palmer. I'm the patron of the Faith Long-Term Plans and CEO of Faith Invest. And it's a particular delight for us as Faith Invest to be hosting this particular webinar. So I will be handing over later to Anna Francois, who's the head of membership for Faith Invest. What is a faith long-term plan? At its most fundamental level, it's an audit. It's an asset audit. It is looking at what we as faiths actually own, what we have, what we influence, what we control. We run 50% of schools around the world. We run about a third of all hospitals and universities and higher education. We are the third largest investing group, and that's something we'll be going deeper into today. But we are also the setters of examples. We have wisdom, we have experience, we have hundreds, thousands of years of knowledge that we can build upon. But we have been somewhat backward, I think, in coming forward. We have tended to see as faiths that we were there to critique, not to be the stakeholders, the shareholders that we actually are. And this is particularly true when it comes to the world of investments. We have an enormous potential that has yet to be really unlocked, an enormous potential to actually shape the way that the financial world functions and thinks. So what is a faith long-term plan? Well, it's ambitious because it's actually asking all the faith groups to go 2 or 3 steps further than they would normally do, and to look at their impact, a very popular phrase within the finance world, their impact on people and planet, to take the phrase that has been popularized by Pope Francis. It is basically saying that as faiths, we have core beliefs, core teachings. And from those core beliefs and teachings, we have core values. And those core values do, but could do more in shaping how we react and respond, use and look after the planet and people. We're not just doing this as faiths. We are supported in this by groups like WWF all around the world, World Resources Institute, and other such organizations. Because there is a real desire now, particularly as a result of the COVID crisis, for us all to find values from which we can actually build a different world. And we as the faiths have those values. They're there in our sacred texts. They're in our history and in our teachings. They're in our great figures that inspire and lead us. And so in partnership with the UK government in particular, ahead of COP26, we were asked if we could mobilize the faith networks again. We did this back in 2009 with the first round of faith long-term plans, which were very successful. And now already we've got double the number of plans we had then. And we're beginning to build partnerships also with groups that will take the model of the faith long-term plans out to their own faithful. A very large one is with the Laudato Si platform being created by the Vatican to support the 7-year plan for Laudato Si rollout, and that will automatically bring probably around another 700 or 800 Catholic organizations into this partnership. We have similar groups with many others. It is a 10-year commitment or a 7 to 10-year commitment, depending on the timescale. In some faiths, 10 is not an auspicious number. 11 is a better number, so we go for 11. In other faiths, it's 8. It's in a sense asking each faith, based on their own values and teachings, to create a program that makes sense to them, but that they're not doing alone, and that there will be support and partnerships to help them. And as I say, it does build on something that we tried very successfully back in 2009 in advance of the Copenhagen COP, which was not the success that many had hoped. And the timeline, well, from now until November, which is when the Glasgow COP takes place, there is the process of essentially signing up as many faith groups as we can and as wish to be involved. We may well end up, given the partnerships we're doing with groups like the Laudato Si platform and the CBC GDF, our main partner in China, we may well be over 1,000 projects. But the aim is that by the end of September, we can announce the range of faith groups that are going to do plans give some kind of hint, some sense of what the key issues will be. We're already seeing that. Investment is going to be a major one. So is food, so are forests, so is energy. And then we intend to be able to really launch the details, because many of our faith partners, for example, Hazon, will not have their plans ready by the end of this year, but they will have them ready by the summer of next year. And next year, in June, it's the 50th anniversary of the first ever UN conference on the environment, the Stockholm Conference of 1972. And at that very auspicious event, we will really roll out the scale of commitments that faiths are making. And then from then onwards, we will be developing the programs as they roll out. We are going to be there for the long haul. Our partners are going to be there for the long haul, because we know that as faiths, one of our great skills is that we are able to bring about change whilst people think that not a lot has changed. And that takes time and it takes confidence. So with that, I would like to focus on the 7 areas, which I think many of you are aware of. Today, we're looking at faith-consistent use of assets, and we've already looked at buildings and land. We've done education. We are planning now a webinar on youth work, on voluntary work with children rather than just education. Media and advocacy are also going to be in 2 different webinars. Wisdom is coming up shortly, lifestyles we've just done, and partnerships and celebrations. All of these are available on the Faith Invest website. So here we are now with the next one. And to introduce this and to take us through this, I am delighted to hand over to my colleague, Nana Francois, who heads our membership program in Faith Invest. Nana, over to you.
Martin, thank you very much for that introduction, and hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar on financial assets long-term plans, where as part of this faith long-term plan process, as part of these long-term commitments, we're asking and seeking to answer the question, how can your organization integrate faith beliefs and values to practice faith-consistent investing to drive better environmental and social outcomes? Maybe just to give a little bit of a context before we get into the detail and meet our panelists. With the first set of plans that were done, it was very interesting and notable that many of the groups found the financial assets component one of the hardest ones in which to get into detail and to really make firm and strong commitments. And part of the reason why Faith Invest exists is actually to help faith groups to also look at their financial assets and to work through what does it mean to invest faith consistently, and what does it mean to really use all of our assets, including our financial ones, to drive things forward. And so given the nature of this subject and the complexity at one level, we'll be addressing this in 2 webinars. Today is really about case studies of groups who have gone there and who have lessons to teach us and ways to inspire us. And then there will be a more detailed technical webinar on March 23rd, which is really where you'll get to see the work of Faith Invest, where we begin creating faith-consistent policy and guidelines for faith-based asset groups. So today, listen, get inspired, and then come back at the end of the month to start to get into detail. And with all of these things, though, it's important to start from the high-level questions before you run into the detail. And it is very much a case of, with financial assets, as with any other type of assets, asking us these kind of questions, asking ourselves these questions. What do we have? What do we give? And are there ways in which we could give differently or more effectively to spur investment rather than just giving? How do we invest? How informed and equipped are we and those we rely on in order to invest the way we want? And ultimately, what do we aspire to, and what does our faith and our belief drive us to want to do? So we are delighted to welcome today 3 speakers. We will start with Suzanne Ismail from Quakers in Britain to tell us a bit about divest and invest, and the Quaker application of really thinking about how to be faith consistent with investments. We will then have a recording from Nigel Savage, President and CEO of Hazon, which is the largest Jewish environmental network. And whilst he can't be with us in person and we have a video, we do have his colleague Hannah Henza to answer questions later on. And then we will close with Dr. Vinya Ariaratne, president of Sarvodaya Strategy movement, to really talk to us about how they started and are delivering through their development finance institutions, and how development finance institutions can not only help to invest in the community, but how they can also be an opportunity for others to invest and be faith-consistent investors in this particular opportunity. So thank you all. I'm looking forward to this myself. I hope you are too. And we will start with Suzanne.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Nana. Hello, everybody. It's really good to be here today. I'm here to tell quite a particular story around faith-consistent investment, and that's the story of how Quakers in Britain divested from fossil fuels. Before I get into that, just a few words about Quakers and Quakers in Britain for those of you who don't know us. We are the central or the national organisation for the Quaker community in Wales, Scotland and England. We're a relatively small religious community. About 20,000 people attend our meetings on a weekly basis. And I'm part of the central staff team that serves that community. I'm going to be talking today about our central assets. So that's the assets owned by our national religious body. Local Quaker communities are all responsible for their own financial assets. Most of them do have a similar approach to us centrally, but there may be some differences. So why I'm talking about us as a central organisation here. So what did we do? What has our approach been? Well, in a nutshell, and I'd say this is just part of our approach to faith-consistent investing, but it's been quite a big story for us over the last few years. In a nutshell, back in around 2013, we sold all of our investments in fossil fuel companies and companies involved in the production or extraction of fossil fuels. As far as we're aware, at that time, we were the first church to do that at a national level in Britain. Although there have been many others who've joined us on that journey since, which has been great. And in some ways for us, although it was a very big thing for us at the time, it was actually quite a simple process. We made a decision and we asked our investment managers to implement that decision, and they did it. Of course, with every story, there's usually a lot more to it to that. And there was a lot of work done behind the scenes to get us to the point where we were able to make that decision and make it confidently. And when I talk to other people about our ethical investment approach, that's the bit that people really want to hear about. So that's what I want to share with you today. We get asked questions, you know, like how did we get agreement to do it in the first place? Was it controversial? Were we scared of losing money? So it's that kind of area that I want to cover, really. The Quaker concern on environmental issues and climate change isn't new, and neither is our approach to ethical financial stewardship. It's something we've been concerned about for decades, if not longer. But I want to start this particular story in the summer of 2011. And that was quite a significant point for our community, because it was then that we made a corporate commitment to become a low carbon sustainable community. When we made that commitment, we didn't know exactly what it would mean in practice, but Quakers were asked to go out and act in faith on the issue of climate change as individuals, as local Quaker communities, and to go out into the world and engage with government and businesses to make wider structural changes. And that was about the same sort of time we were writing our first long-term plan. So as part of that, it was obvious to us that we needed to look at investments as part of this. We already had what we thought at the time was quite a well-developed approach to investments, but we wanted to increase the emphasis that we put on climate change factors as part of that. But actually, when I look back, and it was quite an interesting exercise preparing for this webinar, when I look back at that time, it's quite surprising that divestment wasn't explicitly on the agenda for us. And not that many people were talking about it. It was seen as quite a new thing, really. For some Quakers, it was an obvious step that we needed to be taking, but as a national community, not so much at that time in 2011. But things changed pretty quickly, actually. And for us, the change point came a couple of years later in 2013. Quakers had been making really good progress on their commitments to lower their own carbon footprint. And as a national church, we were stepping up our campaigning activities, particularly calling for the UK energy system to become less dependent on fossil fuels. And we were becoming increasingly concerned about extreme forms of energy production like fracking. And that was the sort of time that studies were emerging, showing that if we want to have a reasonable chance of meeting international climate targets, something like 80% of fossil fuels needed to stay in the ground. So that was quite a significant time for us. Yet, at the same time, when we looked at our investment portfolio, there was a bit of a contradiction, really. At the time, our investment portfolio, which was mostly in equities, was worth about £21 million. And just under 4% of that was invested in fossil fuel companies, particularly Statoil and BG Group were the main companies that we held shares in. They were very much the best in their sector on carbon issues at that time. But that was a real tension for us. On the one hand, Quakers were speaking out and campaigning on the need to end fossil fuel dependency, yet on the other hand, we had investments in companies that were profiting from that very thing. And that just didn't feel okay to us. You invest to build for the future, and there was a growing discomfort about some aspects of what future we might be helping to build. So we really felt that we had a responsibility to look at that again quite seriously. Now, anyone who knows Quakers will know that we have quite a complex accountability and decision-making structure. And ultimately, the decision about divesting from fossil fuel companies was made by our trustee body. They consulted widely on this. They took the advice of our investment committee, they consulted with our investment managers, and they sought the views of our national representative structures. So there was really quite widespread consideration of this matter within our community. And for me, that was really important to feel that this was a decision that was held well by Quakers across Britain. As part of that, we looked at three options, essentially continuing with the status quo, so a best in sector investment approach, perhaps with enhanced dialogue, trying to influence fossil fuel companies to improve their transition plan. The second option was to further tighten our investment criteria so that we only invested in companies involved in gas production, which of course is lower carbon, or to fully divest from fossil fuel companies, which is what we went for in the end. And as you'd expect, throughout that process of discussion and discernment, a range of views were expressed from all sorts of different perspectives. But by the end of it, there was a really strong feeling throughout our community and throughout all of those different structures and committees that I named, that this was absolutely the right thing for us to do at the time. And it was absolutely the right thing for us to do, even if it meant the possibility of some potential extra financial risks, which actually hasn't been an issue for us, but it was part of the consideration. So within a few months, our investment manager had sold investments in those companies that I'd named and reinvested all of that money and then some in renewable energy companies. And we amended our investment policy as well, which was a really important thing to do, to embed that decision and to show that this wasn't a one-off sale, this was a central plank of our investment approach. So the impact, I mean, in short, it's been really positive for us. Financially, as I said, our portfolio has held up well in comparison to others, and we really don't have a sense that this has been detrimental to us financially at all. More important, I would say, that there is the sense from within our Quaker community that this was something that Quakers were really called to do at that particular point in time, and it was an opportunity for us to genuinely put our money where our mouth is and our faith into action, and that's been really powerful for us as a community. It's also given additional credibility to our political advocacy and campaigning work. It's fairly safe to say that we've encouraged others to consider this course of action. We've shown it's possible. So it's been a really positive outcome for us. Like any other faith community, we have our own way of doing things and a particular approach to financial stewardship. Some of those absolutely helped us on the way to making this decision. Others might have complicated it or hindered it a little bit, and I'd be really happy to share more of that in the Q&A and discussion session later. But in the meantime, I hope that was a useful snapshot of what we've been doing, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for that insight and that detail, and we will definitely come back on some of the hindrances and challenges, but appreciated your point about the need to embed it as policy and not just as a one-off action, which I think is a really important message to share from today. Next, we come to Nigel Savage from Hazon.
Hi, everybody. My name's Nigel Savage. I'm an Englishman in New York. I'm the CEO of an organization called Hazon, Hebrew for Vision, which is the largest environmental organization in the American Jewish community, and perhaps the largest faith-based environmental organization in the United States. I really want to thank Pippa and Nana and Martin and Tilly and everybody in the organizations who have organized this today. And I want to say really genuinely, I'm incredibly honored to have been invited to participate. Before I talk a little bit about Hazon and 7-year plans, I want to say something that I don't normally say, but I particularly want to say to this group. In my first career, way back when, I worked in the city, the English version of Wall Street, and I managed investments. And I, in fact, managed investments for a number of progressive clients. I'm old enough to have done this at the very, very tail end of apartheid in South Africa. And I ran a pension fund for one of the largest healthcare unions in Britain. And they wanted to run a South Africa-free portfolio, an apartheid-free portfolio. And they also had a fiduciary obligation to their pensioners to get the best possible investment returns. And so they turned to me to do some work to establish that that which was ethical and moral was also the right thing to do in terms of investment returns. And I did that work, and of course I was very happy to do it. And what I argued then, and I think it has become clearer today in relationship to what we now call ESG, is that if as a business you're doing something that is fundamentally injurious to human beings or to the planet, then sooner or later your business is not going to do so well. And conversely, if you're a business that is fundamentally fixing human or planetary problems or making the world in a material way better, then there is every likelihood that in due course you will outperform. And so I was happy, not merely at that point to run an apartheid-free portfolio, but to have done some of the basic work to enable that to happen in a fiduciary framework. And at this point in human history, as ESG is growing, and as the process of engaging religious communities to deploy our assets more effectively, I'm happy to share that with you at the start. Okay, so Hazon is working to mobilize the Jewish community to create a healthier and a more sustainable world for everybody. Last time around, we worked on the 7-year plans, and it was amazing. It was really interesting. It was really worthwhile. We met some really amazing people, both within the Jewish community and in an interfaith context. We learned an enormous amount, and we were very proud of the 7-year plan that we produced. Just in a small way, we were very tickled that at one point, EcoSeek came to us and said, the Sikh community loves what you have done. Can we simply, as it were, take this and translate it into Sikh? Some of the theological frames, some of the terms, but other than that, take the Jewish plan and apply it in the Sikh community. And we said, fantastic, incredibly honored. And that indeed happened, and good things happened in the Sikh communities. I spoke in a Sikh Gurdwara in DC. All of that was great. That's the good news. There's some bad news. Every religious community has not just different theology, but different structures. And the Jewish community is famously anarchic. People say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. There's also 3 Jews, 5 organizations. Nobody has authority within Jewish life to tell anybody else to do anything else. There is no pope. No rabbi can order people what to do. And I and Chazan and the Jewish environmental movement certainly can't. And so although we created an amazing 7-year plan, I'm not persuaded that in and of itself, because of that plan, the plan unfolded. So now we come to this time around. And this time around, we're thinking about it slightly differently. And I want to share with you some of what we're doing and some of what we've been thinking about. Firstly, the timing this time around is kind of remarkable because Jewish tradition has the notion of Shemitah, a sabbatical year. It's indeed where the notion of a sabbatical year in the English language comes from. And it so happens that the next sabbatical year in Jewish life starts this fall. It starts on September 6th, 2021, which is to say the first full year that will be, in a sense, post-COVID. And so we're really offering this as a frame across the Jewish community. And we're saying, this is an amazing moment to look back over the last 7 years. What have we learned? What has changed? Where have we come from? How have we grown? What have been our challenges? That's part of it. And then secondly, let's start to flesh out the vision for the next 7-year period in Jewish life. Let's look at the period from 2022 to 2029. And to key institutions, synagogues, Jewish day schools, Jewish federations, and with increasing traction, we're saying to them, it's not that we're going to write a 7-year plan for you. We invite you to gather your community, people who are already fired up and involved, bring new people through the door, rabbis, lay leaders, some teenagers, some relevant experts, and start to flesh out a vision for your community 7 years from now. And one by one, we think that that's starting to happen. I want to offer, I think, 2 last things that I want to share. One of them is a frame that we've been using that may be useful in other contexts. And it's what we call a 3x3 grid. Across one axis, education, action, and advocacy. And across the other axis, an individual, an institution, and the wider community. What we've said is, none of us has the knowledge, the time, the interest, the ability to move forward all 9 boxes personally, but institutionally, and certainly across an entire faith community, we need to move forward all 9. And Chazan as an organization is saying to individual Jewish institutions, we're here to help. So for instance, education might be learning the consequences of our food choices in terms of, and including thinking about things like plastic or the anthropogenic consequences of industrial meat. Action would be changing how we eat, and advocacy would be speaking out for change in wider context. You can do that around investments. Education could be learning what are our assets and where they're deployed. Action could be changing them, and advocacy could be speaking up in public space or in other institutions for wider change. So I offer you that. The very last thing that I want to share is that nowadays, when we meet with any group, including private senior groups, when we meet with rabbis and heads of institutions, we always begin by saying, let's firstly just note how everybody feels guilty. Let's note how everybody feels disempowered and overwhelmed at the gap between the scale of the climate crisis and issues of environmental sustainability, me as an individual human being. And a remarkable number of people in our experience feel bad about even engaging in these topics because they feel, oh, but I'm doing X and I'm not doing Y. And increasingly, we think it's right to begin with that, have that conversation, unpack it, create some space. But then after that, there is a famous Jewish tradition from the Mishnah, the rabbinic compendium from 2000 years ago, that simply says, we're not required to complete the task. but neither can we desist from it. And the first step is unpacking that we may feel disempowered, but the second is to say, okay, let's move beyond that and start to effect change. So my name's Nigel Savage. I'm at Khazan, nigel@khazan.org. I hope that I will have a chance to meet with you and interact with you at some point, but if I could ever be of use, please don't hesitate to be in touch.
Thank you very much for that, and we appreciate Nigel's words and the framework that he shared around education, action, and advocacy, and the comment around it may not be for us to complete the work, but it doesn't mean we can desist from it. And I'm sure we'll have more insights from Hannah later around how the approach is changing with this next set of plans for Khazan. We welcome our last speaker, Vinya.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure for me to join this meeting today. I would like to share some slides that will help me to articulate what I like to say better. So I have titled this the Sarvodaya approach to economic empowerment and financial inclusion. And I'm representing the Sarvodaya Strategy movement of Sri Lanka, which is a social movement which is based on Buddhist teachings, but we have also now reached a stage of evolution where we are also working with many communities to improve their economic well-being, and also through financing various projects through multiple channels, and which include a major financial institution, which is the only finance institution which is owned by a charity in Sri Lanka. So our movement is based on the Buddhist teachings, which recognizes that all living beings are interconnected. And also there are multiple determinants of poverty. Poverty is not just about lack of access to basic resources or be unable to fulfill their own resources, but also disempowerment. The people do not have a say about how they could achieve, how they could manage their lives without interference from outside. So we see development as an outcome as well as a process. And we highlight the notion of well-being, social well-being, economic well-being, spiritual well-being. So we see development as an awakening process that takes place between individuals as well as communities, which encompasses spiritual, moral, cultural, social, economic, and political dimensions. So the two words, the Sarvodaya Strategy, means awakening of all through sharing your time, thoughts, and energy. So it's a very holistic vision of development where we try to awaken individuals, families, village communities, urban communities, the country as a whole, and also the world in those 6 dimensions. So it started 62 years ago in 1958 as a movement, voluntary movement, where students and teachers got together and went to rural communities to learn from the people and also start working with them, sharing their pain, sharing their resources to be able to uplift their living conditions. And then it was an idea that people can really change their own lives, particularly a country like Sri Lanka, which gained independence from the British after 150 years, and before that another 200 odd years from other colonial powers. So we were trying to build confidence that people themselves can make a difference. So the whole philosophy was based on sharing of your labor to create something, fulfill a need in the village, and this was encapsulated in this motto: we build the road and the road builds us. So the journey started in 1958, and after 60 years, we have reached about 15,000 out of about 38,000 village communities in Sri Lanka. And it has not been an easy journey. We have also had our own share of challenges. However, it survived as a very effective social movement based on Buddhist traditions, but which encompasses, which is a very inclusive philosophy. Sri Lanka being a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, we have people and communities from all religious and ethnic communities being part of this movement. And coming into the economic dimension, I would like to say that since from the very beginning, the movement had a very entrepreneurial approach to development, because we wanted the people themselves not to be dependent on outside, but also try to develop their own self-reliance. So satisfaction of basic human needs was the focus, and all the resources as much as possible were mobilized locally with people gifting their time, their intellect, their knowledge, their land, their money. So it was a collective effort. So it was starting with programs like preschools. It was a process where the communities got together and shared their resources. There was also money, but money was not the primary input or primary investment in this social development process. So finally, we were able to come up with a model which is being practiced even up to now, where you start with non-economic activities to build confidence in the people, which we call the psychological infrastructure development phase, and then try to organize the village as a effective community which understands their own situation and which has the skills and the knowledge to be able to address the village needs, and we help in that process, and they become then the organization that represents the village becomes a legal entity, and then this community-based organization takes on the responsibility to improve the economic conditions of the people. And until such time, we do not start monetary transactions or any investments in the community based on funding. Then only that they move into somehow address their economic needs and have a sustainable income to satisfy their needs in the village and to reach the status of a self-governing village or Gram Swaraj. So 10 basic human needs, I'll not go into detail, starting with environments, water supply, sanitation, nutrition, clothing, housing, healthcare, and so on. To support this process, we have developed an infrastructure, organizational infrastructure over 62 years, and it supports this village-based organic process, which any village will take anywhere from 3 years to 5 years to go through these 5 stages very organically and achieve self-sustenance. And we have a presence throughout the country. And now I would like to focus a little bit more on the economic and financial inclusion strategy. So while focusing on basic human needs as a strong development education component, where we try to develop the capacity, we train hundreds and thousands of village leaders in different skills. And another very important point is about capital formation. Though we have a very effective microfinance and small and medium enterprise development program, we look at capital formation not just as financial capital formation in the village, or asset formation not just in monetary terms. The spiritual, social capital also is very important to us. So when you say spiritual capital, we try to promote inner peace through meditation, and also so many collective action that are fundamental to Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, and Islamic communities living in Sri Lanka. Then social relationships are very important. Then only based on this foundation, we go into mobilize financial resources to help them to start their own business enterprises to be self-reliant. So after this 60 years of working in Sri Lanka, the founding of the Sarvodaya Development Finance Company, SDF, has been a very important milestone. It happened in 2010. Before that, it was actually a microfinance organization. Now we are a key player as a development finance company, which has majority shareholding by our charity, the movement. However, we have to comply with the central bank regulation, so we can't have exclusively 100% ownership, but we have now broad-based the ownership to village societies. More than 1,200 village societies have now invested in this company, not big amounts, but they are now the owners of this company. So just to conclude, because I have only another 2 minutes, we believe in an economic system where only one portion goes for consumption, but 2 portions go for business or investment or industry, and then we keep one for emergency. So based on this philosophy, we have tried to address the ills of the present economic model and look at an alternative economic system where we look at satisfying the basic human needs using the renewable resources to technology, giving prominence to gender issues, and so on. And this economic system is not trying to create a rich few, not trying to make profits by destroying the environment or disrupting communal harmony. And even though there are legal investments, they may not be moral, so we refrain from those things. And then trying to also give the idea that we need to voluntarily give up wasteful lifestyles of living and share part of our wealth for the benefit of other people. And we need to address some of the structural injustices that are there that keep the majority of the people powerless and poor. So also not regard spiritual activities as uneconomical in the current system of economy. So our aim is to build a just, sustainable and compassionate social order that fulfills the basic human needs of the community through individual and collective awakening. I stop here. I'll be happy to answer any questions and cover other areas which I have not covered in my presentation. Thank you very much.
Vinya, thank you so much for that great presentation, talking us through the whole history of the Sarvodaya movement and how it's grown and how that village model has really delivered. And I love the concept of capital formation being spiritual and social as well as economic, and the whole sense that we really need to use our investments to really transform. So at this stage, I invite Martin back to start the conversations with the panelists.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you very much indeed. And Vinya, wonderful to see you again, my friend. Wonderful to see you. This man is one of the most busy men on the planet. We are deeply honored to have you join us, along with, now Hannah is representing Nigel, and Susanna is representing herself. So we have a good starting point. Susanna, I want to start with you. You kind of posed a certain sort of tension between what you were engaged with as the active Quaker community in the bigger world, particularly lobbying with governments, lobbying with multinationals, with other agencies and so forth, and what you were able to do internally. Was there a point at which the external was ahead of the internal and drove the internal, or was it the other way around? In other words, were you able to still advocate for change even when you hadn't quite made it yourself, or did you have to wait until the change had been made internally before you could say, we've done this, why don't you? How did you deal with that tension?
That's a really good question, actually. There was a moment where it felt like we really needed to take a step back and take stock, to think about how consistent we were being in terms of that external messaging and our internal position. And it kind of crept up on us fairly slowly. I think it's a good indication of how you need to keep reassessing your approach to investment, because the world around you changes. I mean, certainly, if I think 15 years ago, our approach to investment in fossil fuels was seen as pretty cutting edge then. And I don't think we hadn't got all of the scientific studies showing, the extent of the climate crisis, how we needed to transition over a relatively short period of time. Some of the stuff around 80% of fossil fuels needing to stay in the ground to have a chance of reaching international climate targets. Those were all things that that made us take a step back and think, okay, what was good enough a few years ago, is it good enough now? And is that right? I think we probably could have carried on speaking out and doing that campaigning if we wanted to, and there was certainly a point where it was a live discussion internally and we didn't stop the campaigning. We were just having the rest of the conversation along the side, and we probably could have kept on doing that, because actually our exposure to fossil fuels within the investment portfolio was pretty low, really. But it just didn't feel right to us in the end after having gone through all of that process. So we didn't stop anything. We did it all as a parallel process, but absolutely right. There was a point where we just thought, you know, with integrity, can we keep doing what we're doing? And the answer to that eventually was, actually, no, we do need to change.
So you had to be faith consistent, both in what you did with the money and in what you advocated other people did as well. That was the tension. Thank you, Suzanne. Hannah, can I ask you, interestingly, the three groups we have here today, none of you are the big hitters in terms of religious investments. Or if you are, Hannah, you've kept it a very quiet secret, and I need to clearly quiz Nigel more thoroughly. But in comparison with, say, the Church Commissioners or the Church of Sweden, or indeed one of our biggest religious foundations that's got 30 billion, you know, you're small scale. And one of the issues that I know confronts an awful lot of faith groups that want to be more consistent in their investing is, how do you do that when you've not got, you know, a spare 100 million to pop into a project? So, and I think particularly in the Jewish community, we work very closely with J-Lens, the major network that actually brings together the investment portfolios of many, about 150 Jewish groups. How do you deal with, Nigel summed it up very well, the old joke about 2 Jews, 3 different opinions. I've not heard one about 3 Jews and 5 organizations, but that does have a ring of truth. How do you deal, in a sense, how do you deal with that fragmentation? And how do you feel that can be brought together in a more collective way, so that, for example, the assets spread across those 150 Jewish communities could be more effective than just on their own? Is there any kind of program or development that you can look at that achieves that?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And you're right, Martin, we don't just have an extra spare, 100 million lying around. However, what we do have is that framework that Nigel laid out, that education, action, and advocacy framework. And it plays a lot to what Vinya was saying, actually, as well, about the sort of psychological preparations that people need to go through before they're willing to take action. And there's a lot of what we find is our role is more of the education piece. We can get leaders in a room to have a conversation about why this really matters. And that's what we found we've been most successful at, is more of the sort of community organizing, thinking about who are the right people to be having these conversations with, because you're right, we don't control the large pots of money in the American Jewish community, but we know the people who do. And if we can have a conversation with them about why this matters, as Suzanne said, bring up the science, bring up the success stories of what we've actually seen be accomplished and the good that it's created. And then in our work, we put a Jewish moral lens on the conversation. We say, from, as a people of faith, our text, our tradition, our 3,000 years of Jewish history tells us that we have a responsibility here. And how are you, as the leader of this organization, as the leader of this pool of money, the person who can direct these funds, how are you responding with that responsibility, and what are you really thinking about doing? And so we've seen the most success in having those conversations, and we're starting to have those conversations again now as we lead up to, as Nigel said, the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, thinking about, in Jewish life, we think a lot about cycles of time. Every 7 days, we have a day of rest. Every 7 years, we have a year of rest. Every 7 years of 7, we have, so we think a lot about cycles of time. And as we come up on this very rather auspicious year of the year of rest, and how it corresponds to the need of the world in this moment, it's a very compelling argument for even our most observant, conservative, Jewish colleagues to think about, what does this really mean? And that's kind of the direction we're taking right now.
Thank you very much indeed, Hannah. I remember Rabbi Arthur Herzberg of the World Jewish Congress telling me of a wonderful tradition that when someone was from the Jewish community was traveling to a foreign country, they would be given grants of money by their community to give to the first person they met who needed it, who could make good use of it. And I've always thought that was such a fascinating notion, that you go as a visitor, but you, as it were, you enhance the capacity of the country you go to. Oh, Vinya, I've got about 47 questions I want to ask you, but I'll stick to probably just one, but I'm not making any promises, Nana. I mean, first and foremost, you've done this extraordinary achievement of creating the Sarvodaya Development Finance. No other group I know within the Buddhist world has done that. In your list of the kind of basic needs that you highlighted, I could hear the basic needs that the Buddha talked about in terms of what people needed: clothing, housing, warmth, food, etc., which are universal. But when you were thinking through developing a finance structure, given particularly the ambiguity in Buddhism by the religious community about having anything to do with money, touching money, what did you draw upon from either Buddhist models or Buddhist teachings that gave you the foundation to build this remarkable structure?
Thank you, Martin. I think it's a very difficult and complex question, but I'll try to answer. My first response is actually Buddhism does not say that money is not important. I think there are many teachings in Buddhism. There's a whole Buddhist economics theory. You must have heard even people like Schumacher has even written chapters in his book Small is Beautiful about Buddhist economics. So it has a very deep economic philosophy, and also money is only part of economy. It's actually the problem also, because now the paper money is really the thing that kills economic empowerment of communities. So what we did was, it was a very natural process where the Buddhist teachings, which are very fundamental to well-being, for example, sharing and caring, we brought it up to development work. You get together and you address a problem, then you see a result. As Hannah said, the educational process should not just be an educational process, but you should see an effect of that process. Then people gain confidence. Oh, my goodness, we can do this, right? So it was the economic development part came little bit later. So that shows in our economic, our village development model also, we don't start with economic activities at the beginning. It's only after we develop that foundation, then you really go into the fundamentals of financial management. It starts with savings, not anything to do with loans or microfinance. That practice of saving, even poor people have a habit of saving. We have tills in our, clay tills. That has been a practice in every home, whether you are poor, just put one coin once a week or something like that. And so that practice, those indigenous practices were somehow structured in a way that it became part of a system. So they started running their own organizations, community-based organizations, funds in a very effective way, and they learned about financial management. It was very consistent with Buddhist teachings, and it has also all the ethical values. You can't. I mean, Buddhism doesn't say that you can't have interest on your loans. No. It's very consistent that when you pool resources together, you have to look at the 4 principles that I have outlined, how to spend your money. Now that is the whole sutra, and that sutra says how you should only consume 1/4, and then have the practice of investing in environmentally friendly and productive things that will help people, help numbers, and in the process you also share. So these are very, very scientific principles, even if you look at modern economics. So that is how we were able to perceive that in the minds of people, that what we were trying to set up was very much consistent. However, having said that, we still have to convince why we should come under central bank regulation, why we should we are pushed to go to the stock market now. So that is a model that we reject. But the legal compliance requires you to do that. So we are pushed towards that. So I wouldn't say that everything is fine. We are battling also with some of the influencers. And there was a question from Arthur. I like to also connect to this response and answer it. He says, how can you counter these multinationals and commercial interests in when you try to empower communities economically? That's very true. But the moment you have small communities in large numbers, empowered and connected, then it's a very strong force, and they can then really influence the macro structures. We are getting there. It's a difficult journey. That's why we need more support, also solidarity from like-minded individuals and organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I also just wanted to pick up very briefly on your comment about the psychological. One of our trustees for Faith Invest is Shonaka Rishi Das from the Oxford Centre of Hindu Studies. He always makes the point that the West's model of poverty is entirely to do with cash, with money. And he makes the point that you make. Poverty is poverty of families, poverty of spirituality, poverty of opportunities. And it's one of the critiques that particularly from Hindu and Buddhist organizations was made of the SDGs, that they only quantify by cash, by poverty as a financial thing, not a spiritual, not a personal thing. How fundamental, you've made that your building block. How easy do you find it to explain to other organizations that that's your broad breadth of what poverty is not to have the family, the friends, the community, the spiritual?
Yeah, so it's very difficult. Still, people measure wealth in terms of money. So wealth, it's spiritual wealth, it's a social wealth. There are so many things. But I think the COVID pandemic, the COVID, threat the last 1 year. I mean, today is exactly 1 year since the first case was detected in Sri Lanka. So I think it reminded people of the uselessness of just having, physical wealth unless you have that protection for everybody. So that reminded, but it's very difficult. The moment, the lockdowns are eased up, then people just drift back to their normal this thing and again running after money. But I think that whole movement which evolved through a lot of work and people seeing the people coming out of poverty in every way. I mean, of course, the physical poverty, overcoming physical poverty is an important part of it. You need to see visible opportunities created for people who otherwise wouldn't have opportunities coming up, and their children going to school and the youth having employment. All these things are important. But then at the same time, if you see that we had a war for 26 years in Sri Lanka, why did that happen? It's not just poverty. It has to do with identity. It has to do with dignity. So many factors. So I think people do learn. It's the governance structure which is the biggest stumbling block. The politics, they always try to use these divisions, and that's a major challenge for us. Otherwise, I think the human nature is such that there is that natural inclination towards looking at well-being in a holistic way. And COVID, I think, has reminded us that it's more than ever is relevant today in this world. I hope that answers. It's a difficult question to answer.
Thank you. Nana, back to you. Thank you all, three of you, for being so nice and answering my question.
Thank you, Martin. Great questions there. And a couple more from the audience just to share. Suzanne, perhaps we can come back to you. And there is a particular question on how you engage your existing investment managers in the divestment story. Did your existing managers enable you to divest? Did you need to switch to different managers? How did you kind of bring up the conversation around divesting being part of what was important and core to the Quaker values? I think there's a lot for the community to learn from that. So please share anything you can on that, Suzanne.
Yeah, very happy to. I think we've been fortunate throughout this process that we've got a really good relationship with our investment managers. we have the same investment managers now as we had at the start of this process, and we really didn't feel any need to change that. Essentially, we meet with them quite regularly anyway, so you know, they know Quakers well, and they know that climate issues were very important to us. So in a sense, when we asked this question, it wasn't a complete surprise to them. And they did a really good job of looking at our portfolio, answering our questions about where our money was, looking at the different options that might be open to the ones that I summarised in my little presentation, and really spelling out what the potential impact of making those choices might be. I felt that they were very open with us. You know, they're also not unused to getting questions a bit like this from Quakers. It's not the first kind of issue that we've asked them to do a bit of research for us. And I think their approach was, you know, tell us what you need us to do, and we'll find a way of doing that. And it was really good to have that conversation with them in an open and frank way. Of course, you know, they were very keen, as you would expect, to focus on the financial side of things, and they did a very good job of making us aware of potential implications. But for us, it was a fairly simple process. I think that does reflect the fact that we don't really have very much pooled investment at all. So we have a money manager who invests on our behalf, and we're their sort of only client asking them to do those particular things. So that was a factor that definitely helped us. But I would say overall, you know, it was a really good relationship that we were able to harness, and that's helped. It really has.
Thank you. And maybe just following on, continuing from that, when you shifted, or as you're shifting from divestment to investment, what was the process, or what is your process of aligning your investments? You did mention that you went from divesting to investing in renewables, and that you actually over-invested. It'd be great to hear some insights on the process, and again, how engagement has been on that side of the balance.
I mean, from our perspective, it was a pretty simple one of giving the investment managers an instruction once we'd made our own decision, and they did that. I mean, what I would say is, in terms of the reinvestment, if you look at where they've put that money, it's mostly in fairly mainstream renewable energy companies, stuff that is fairly easily tradable on the main British exchanges. What we would like to do more of in future, and this is something actually we're hoping the long-term plans process might help us with, is look at more alternative and impact investment possibilities for us. That's something we'd certainly like to develop, and was a bit of a limitation for us at the particular time we were making that decision. But yeah, I mean, when I say it was simple for us. I guess the guys at Rathbone Greenbank had an awful lot of stuff to think about. Yeah.
Thank you, Suzanne. And there's a question on how the reinvestment process then drove your engagement with renewable energy companies. I might ask you to respond to that, Suzanne, but maybe Hannah also, just from the point of view of Hazon as being a large climate network, how is the positive engagement with those who are doing good? How have you seen that grow, and what has the momentum been there? So maybe to Suzanne first, and then to Hazon from a community perspective.
So I'm just trying to see that question in the chat. I mean, I have to be honest, we've done much less as Quakers in Britain on engaging with renewable energy companies than we did in the old days of engaging with fossil fuel companies. We do, Rathbone Greenbank, our investment managers, they do have an engagement program which they run on behalf of all of their clients, and we've pretty much sort of left them to that. In the days when we did have investments in fossil fuels, because that was an area that we were particularly concerned about, we you know, had a sort of closer eye on what was being done, and certainly I have been part of bits of engagement work myself. But yeah, that's an area that we would need to think about whether we'd like to develop more proactively, actually.
Okay. And to Hannah?
Yeah, one of the most remarkable pieces of significant change that we've seen as this movement and time has built is local policy change. So when we think about, in faith communities in any country, you have local congregations, and then you have sort of regional, organizations that multiple congregations are part of, and then, in the United States, we have statewide, and then we have national. And we define it more as we call it a bottom-up approach in thinking that, as we educate and bring resources to individuals and then congregations, we see those smaller institutions really making policy changes at their level that then they advocate for at the next level and then the next level. And so what we see are starting to see coalitions of smaller local congregations who are working together to say, this is something that we want to tackle. For instance, in the state of Rhode Island, all of the Jewish institutions came together there about 2.5 years ago and said, we no longer want to be powered by fossil fuels. We want to be powered by solar and renewable energy. And so they worked together to create a collaborative approach to that. And now the entire Jewish community of Rhode Island is, or at least the institutional buildings, are powered by renewable energy. And we've seen, examples of that happening in 3 or 4 other states as well. So we see it from the more technical side, and then we also see it from the more sometimes important but sort of less intangible side. Food is a huge component to religious life, particularly Jewish religious life. So much of our holidays and our celebration revolve around meals, and we've seen a ton of positive work on food policy advocacy, thinking about are we primarily serving meat, and what type of meat, and what was the global impact of the carbon that meat produced. Same with dairy, thinking about applying again that moral lens of sacredness to what we're doing. If we have the laws of kashrut, is it really kosher if that animal wasn't treated well, if the climate impact of that animal was greater than the enjoyment of that meal, or things like that. So those local policy changes have really started to sort of snowball into something much larger across the Jewish landscape.
Thank you, Hannah. And your comments kind of raise a question which I'd like to share with both Finia and Suzanne, which is how do you see your role, or how important is your role in terms of influencing the laity in how they also invest, and what kind of strategies have you had and developed to really influence how your laity invests? So maybe Vinya, I'll start with you, because obviously as a development finance institution, some of what you do is lending to communities. How do you influence what they then do with what they receive from you?
Yeah. So what we do is we primarily channel the funds through the existing village organizations, although we also lend to individuals, entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs, and so on. So when you say laity, it's of course the clientele is all lay people. We don't have any clergy in our setup, although we are a Buddhist inspired organization. So here how we do it is that they all know when they apply for a loan, the ethical guidelines are there, so there's a negative list, so they can't borrow money for those things. And also there are people who believe that whatever the surplus that is generated through the investments or through the interest would go to social development. So because the dividend, once it is distributed, will benefit the other development work which are not revenue generating. And also it is not just credit or giving loans, but there are advisory mechanisms, training, incubation of projects, and also helping them with market linkages, new ideas. So it's a whole package that the client receives. So that gives them more confidence about the services provided by our financial institutions, and they develop more loyalty towards the institution. So it's a combination of the ethical values and also the different services that they can get, which they don't get from a traditional financial institution.
Thank you, Vinya. And to Suzanne, how do Quakers in Britain influence their laity, and what strategies have you developed?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question, particularly from a Quaker perspective, as we don't have clergy as such. We are a priesthood of all believers, so we're all the laity, really. I suppose there's a couple of different elements to this. There's been quite a lot of emphasis throughout Nigel and Vinya and Hannah's presentations as well on the importance of conversations. And that has been really, really important for us. Although I've been talking a lot about what we've been doing centrally, alongside that, particularly when we made that commitment to become a low carbon sustainable community, we were seeing quite a lot of Quaker communities and individuals saying, hang on, we know that money's got something to do with this, but we don't quite know how to tackle that subject. So we spent a couple of years really encouraging Quaker communities to do that, and we set up a joint program with our partners at ECCR, running workshops with Quaker communities who wanted to have those conversations, and referring people on to what is now the ECCR Money Makes Change program, which has been a really good resource for Christian communities in the UK. So I think all of that going on enabled Quakers to start unpacking the issues in smaller, safer spaces, and was part of the kind of background noise, I guess, to the national decisions that we had to make. I don't want to say that we wouldn't have made the decisions that we made if we hadn't been doing that work, but it certainly really helped. And it certainly helped Quaker communities at local and regional level make their own decisions around investments and their own approach to fossil fuels as well. So it's been really important, but we found that although the willingness was there, people needed a little bit of a nudge and a help and a framework to start thinking about those kind of conversations. But it is all about the conversations.
And so I've got just a couple more questions, and I think we'll start to wrap up. One, which I guess is in the context of heading towards COP26 and then Stockholm Plus 50 beyond then. And the question speaks to African countries, but I think there's a broader comment to be made here, in the sense that several African countries have found oil or in the process of exploration. What advice would you give to politicians and technocrats in the light of glaring climate challenges associated with newfound oil fortunes? And I note that this is not an exclusively African discovery or find. There's what is the role for faith groups, and I guess in terms of using their investments to really influence how we treat these so-called assets.
Money in the Jewish community is very similar, I think, to money in other faith communities around the world. People have made, as you said, their fortunes in all sorts of ways, many of which involve the production or refinement of fossil fuels, or the byproducts thereafter that are highly dependent on those fuels. We find that we have to tread a very careful line between insulting people who mean very well with their philanthropic dollars, and their livelihoods and how they came into their fortunes, as well as thinking about future generations and the legacy that we're leaving behind. And just yesterday, I was in a conversation with one of these individuals who is very wealthy and was, made his fortune in this sort of fossil fuel sphere. And he said something very surprising to me, which tells me that our work is effective, that we're making progress. He said, I know that I've had a good run, that I've done a lot with my life. I've made quite a bit of money, and I could do anything that I want now. And I'm listening to my grandchildren, and I'm listening to my colleagues and I'm listening to my friends, and I understand that I messed up and I'm part of a problem. And I'd like to do something, in this case with Hazon, to think about how do we create a different legacy. And I don't think everyone is at that point, but I do think that we're starting to have those conversations more and more frequently when we move carefully, when we think about a more holistic approach to these conversations in which we take in every aspect of what's in front of us. And now that sounds a bit optimistic and it's a little rose-tinted glasses, but I do think that going back to that 3x3 grid, that education, action, and advocacy, when you start with a simple conversation of here are the facts, here's where we're at, this is what you need to know, and you ask people to take action based on those facts, based on their faith tradition, based on what we see in front of us, then eventually they do become advocates for change, and they can start to shift that narrative a little bit. That's what we're seeing.
Thank you, Hannah. And then I just have a last question for each of our panelists. What one thing or piece of assistance would make your work on faith-consistent investing easier? And for that one, I will start with Vinya, and then Suzanne, and then Hannah.
Nana, I think what about the future, it's a very difficult transition because of the COVID-19 challenge. But at the same time, I think we are also facing the kind of structural problems we have had in our own economic system, which got surfaced more because of the COVID-19 crisis. So moving forward as a financial institution which is very inclusive in terms of its approach, finding new ways of really complying on one hand with the regulatory mechanisms, at the same time trying to respond to communities' needs, particularly at a time when they are under so much pressure, and some have lost their livelihoods, lost their jobs. We have thousands of Sri Lankans who have been working in the Middle East as migrant workers. They have lost their jobs coming back to the country. Then a lot of people have been laid off. So we are trying to use this as an opportunity also, because I think it's not just in Sri Lanka, but in many other low-income countries, there is a brain drain, or there is also people leaving the villages, rural communities to find jobs outside. So now we are seeing these villages having these people coming back to their villages where they have lost jobs. So what we are trying to say is that don't think them as people who have lost jobs and come back to villages, and then now the village unemployment is high, but take it as the village talent which left the village have now come back. They have come back with some more experience. Oh, okay, they may be affected psychologically, they may be now demoralized, sometimes even traumatized, but let's have healing. And this is where our spiritual values come in. So that's where the economics and spiritual values from any religion comes into play. So let's try to create new opportunities. Let's do an audit of assessment of their skills and what they are bringing back. Then we connect to our, if they need finances, we'll address them. And that's how we plan to move forward.
Thank you, Vinya. And Suzanne, to you, what one thing or piece of assistance would make work on faith-consistent investing easier?
Thanks. So I guess from my perspective, where I sit in a British community where finance is often seen as a bit scary and something that other people should be worrying about. And I'm not just talking about Quakers here, I'm talking across society generally. I think for me, more participation and more people being willing to discuss and think about financial stuff and the ethical implications of that is really important, because that's part of what has helped us as a community take some steps forward. It's not always been easy, but we are all part of this financial structure and system, and we all have a little role to play, even if we don't necessarily think we do right now. So more people getting involved, more financial education, and transparency actually about where investments are held and what the implications of those might be.
Thank you, Suzanne. And Hannah?
First, I just want to recognize what Vinya and Suzanne said. They're both right in many ways. We're in a very difficult moment in time and in history, and what that means for the future is still, I think, uncertain. And Suzanne, I think in many ways, I would have said something similar. The thing that we get asked over and over again when we sit down with cities or congregations to say, let's take on this work is how? Show me a roadmap. This is still such new territory. We're seeing lots of conversations at the individual level about how are your investments managed, what are the values you're representing with your money, but on the sort of large scale foundation philanthropic level that we really need to be talking about, that conversation is still very, very, very new. And I think to a certain extent, there's a little bit of fear there, right? The old system is known. It's been successful for them. It's made quite a bit of money for them. And so stepping into this new territory without a roadmap, without a sort of step-by-step, this is how this is going to be successful, and by the way, continue to make you a lot of money, that I think is, if I could wave my magic wand, like that's what I would have.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I mean, it's a great conclusion to this webinar, and I guess introduction to the one that's coming up on the 23rd, because part of the work that Faith Invest does with its members is to really help them set out that roadmap and then execute it, both creating the plan and then implementing the plan. And where we start is by creating policies for faith consistent investments and guidelines. And it's really starting from your faith positions, from your values, to how you're positioning both your investment and your divestment into the details of policy and then individual guidelines. So I thank you all panelists for kind of giving us a flavor of some of the challenges and opportunities. I encourage you to, and everyone who's listening, to come and join us on the 23rd when we kind of start to get into the meat of the work of how do you set that framework, that policy, that sense of direction against which everybody can gather and actually start to implement the change that we want to see. Thank you all, and I'll leave it to Martin to give us the closing word.
Thank you very much indeed, Nana. And a huge thank you to Vinya, to Hannah and Nigel, and to Suzanne for taking us deeper into this. I'm enormously grateful, as Nana has said. We have another seminar, a webinar particularly on this. And this has been a wonderful one too for Faith Invest, because Faith Invest is hosting the Faith long-term plans. But our heart, our reason for existing, is to look at the assets and to focus on how those assets can become more faith consistent. What I take away from this, from all three of you, is that people and the communities are the fundamental asset who happen to manifest themselves through buildings and to keep those buildings going through the investment of their finances. But for me, you've taken me back, all three of you, to the fact that in the end, this is about individuals as communities making decisions about what kind of future they want and using their assets, their skills. I loved your point, Vinya, about the people coming back from the Middle East and becoming a resource in the villages again. It's that kind of thinking that Faith Invest is trying to push. And I think, Nana, for me, it's broadened what I think we think of as assets beyond just even the buildings, the land, and the finance, to this notion of the communities, which we've always known, but I don't think I've heard it put so powerfully as you three have done. So a huge thank you to all of you, to those of you who are probably got up quite early to have breakfast, and to those of you who are about to go to bed. Thank you for joining us, and so many thanks to all of you for your contribution. Join us on the 23rd if you can, or later into April for the one on wisdom. Many, many thanks indeed, and thank you to the team behind all this.